March 2011, southeastern Poland. The last tractor rolls through the gate of a 10,000-acre farm, and the gate closes behind it. No clean-up crew follows, no conservation biologist, no reseeding contract. Just 10,000 acres of exhausted agricultural land left to whatever comes next. The expectation, from the handful of researchers who even noticed, was modest. Some scrubland, maybe invasive weeds, perhaps a few deer at the margins. That was March 2011. But by 2026, those same acres had become the most species-dense, rewilded landscape in modern European history, with apex predators nobody invited, and ecosystems that took centuries to build elsewhere, assembling themselves in under 15 years. That's not what anyone planned for. And the data still can't fully explain why it happened so fast. Which leaves the question sitting at the centre of everything that follows. What does a landscape actually become when humans simply stop? I'm Dr. Henry Vale, and what you're about to watch is the full arc of Europe's most dramatic accidental wilderness, told across 15 years of field data, satellite imagery, and 4 X-Force expeditions that put boots on that ground between 2023 and 2026. This isn't a story about a conservation program. Nobody planned this. Nobody released animals into a carefully managed enclosure or wrote a grant proposal for what happened here. A farm went economically unviable, the gates closed, and the land was left alone. That's the whole intervention. What followed is the subject of this film. We're going to move through this in 3 distinct phases: the abandonment itself and what the silence of the first years actually looked like at the soil level. Then the succession, the slow and then suddenly very fast process by which something wild began to reassemble. And finally the explosion, the documented return of species that had no mapped reason to be there, arriving in numbers that upended what ecologists thought they knew about recovery timelines. The X-Force expeditions are our lens into the present. Our teams entered the site across 3 consecutive years, and what they recorded on the ground is different from what the satellite data alone suggested. Sometimes dramatically different. The through line underneath all of it is a single uncomfortable idea, that the most powerful conservation tool we may have is restraint, not action, not intervention, just the decision to leave something alone and not go back. Whether that idea holds up under 15 years of evidence is exactly what this film is here to test. How does someone go from 10,000 acres of productive farmland to a biological near desert? Walk back through the decades of decisions that made it so, and the answer becomes both obvious and quietly devastating. For most of the 20th century, this land in Central Europe worked the way industrial agriculture was designed to work: efficiently, relentlessly. The fields were ploughed in long, unbroken runs, monoculture crops planted in rows so uniform they looked less like food growing and more like a factory floor laid flat. Wheat, then rapeseed, then wheat again. The rotation was economic, not ecological. Heavy machinery moved across the same ground season after season, compressing the soil beneath wheels and tracks that weighed tens of thousands of kilograms. And what that compression does to earth is something most people never think about, because it happens below the surface, invisibly, over years. Healthy agricultural soil has pore space, air pockets, channels where water can move, where roots can push downward, where the microscopic architecture of fungal networks and invertebrate life can exist. Compaction collapses that architecture. It turns living soil into something closer to packed clay. Water stops draining naturally and sits on the surface or runs off entirely. So drainage channels are dug to manage what the soil can no longer handle on its own. The hedgerows that once divided fields and provided corridors for wildlife are removed to make room for larger machinery runs. And then the chemical inputs arrive: herbicides to clear competing plants, pesticides to eliminate insects that interfere with yield, fertilizers to compensate for the nutrients the soil can no longer cycle on its own. Each of those interventions solved a short-term problem. Together, over decades, they produced a landscape that was extraordinarily productive by one measure and almost entirely dead by every other. By the time the 21st century arrived, the land here supported crops and very little else. The hedgerows were gone. The drainage ditches had straightened the hydrology into something a civil engineer would recognise and a wetland bird would not. The soil biome, the fungi, the nematodes, the earthworm populations that are the actual engine of a living landscape had been reduced to a fraction of what it once was. And that wasn't even the part that got people angry. What made the story of this land genuinely controversial was not the farming itself. Industrial agriculture of this kind was standard practice across Central and Eastern Europe for decades. What made it controversial was what the land looked like when someone finally took stock of it. A wildlife survey conducted in the years approaching 2010 found large mammal presence that was, in the most charitable reading, sparse, fragmented. The kind of presence that ecologists describe with the careful language of professional restraint, low density, limited connectivity, reduced species richness, which translates plainly to almost nothing. No wolves, no large ungulates moving through in any meaningful number, raptors passing over but not nesting. The soundscape of a working farm with none of the soundscape of a living ecosystem underneath it. To understand what was at stake, it helps to hold the scale in your mind. 10,000 acres. That is roughly 40 square kilometres, the size of a small European city. Not a field, not a farm in the sense most people picture. A territory. And across that entire territory, the ecological baseline in 2010 was close to zero for anything that required complexity, connectivity, or undisturbed ground. If the land had stopped here, this would be a very different story. A story about agricultural economics perhaps, or about subsidy structures and land use policy. But something else was coming. Something that the European Land Abandonment Report, published in 2023, would later document with precise bureaucratic language the exact cessation of farming operations on this land in the year 2011. Not a gradual wind-down, not a phased transition. A date, a decision. The tractors stopped, and they did not come back. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. Land of this scale, in a region where agricultural productivity had been politically and economically central for generations, simply being walked away from, it triggered questions about ownership, about liability, about what obligations a landowner carries toward the surrounding community when they choose to do nothing. Those questions were not cleanly answered. In some cases, they are still not answered. But the land did not wait for the legal and political arguments to resolve. It had its own timeline. One researcher who had been monitoring the soil biome in the years before 2011 had already noticed something. In the fields at the margins, the edges where the machinery turned, where the chemical application was less consistent, where a drainage ditch had partially collapsed and allowed water to pool, small things were beginning to move. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have registered on a wildlife survey. But the soil was doing something at its edges that it was not doing at its centre, and she wrote about it in terms that were careful enough not to make a claim she couldn't defend, but pointed enough that anyone reading closely would understand what she was suggesting. Nobody listened. The farming continued for another several years. The report sat in a journal, and then, in 2011, the decision was made, and the land was left alone, and what she had seen at the margins began to happen everywhere at once. The first year was quiet in a way that is easy to misread. Quiet, in this context, did not mean empty. It meant that the processes beginning to unfold were small, slow, and happening below the threshold of anything a casual observer would notice. The machinery was gone, the chemical inputs had stopped, the drainage ditches still ran, the soil was still compacted, The hedgerows were still absent. From the road, from a distance, the land looked like farmland that had simply not been planted yet, waiting for the next season. But the seeds were already moving. Wind-dispersed pioneer species do not wait for conditions to be ideal. They move into any available ground, and bare, disturbed soil is exactly what they are designed for. Within months of the 2011 cessation, not years, months, thistle was establishing across the open fields. Willowherb followed, its fine seeds travelling on the same air currents that moved across the unbroken flat of the former cropland. Wild grasses began to thread up through the compacted surface, not because the soil had recovered, but because grasses are among the few plants capable of pushing roots into ground that has been pressed nearly solid. They do not need good soil to start. They need only a crack. This is the part of ecological succession that tends to get skipped in popular accounts, because it is not visually dramatic and the species involved are not charismatic. Thistles and willowherb are not wolves. They do not make for striking footage, but they are doing something structurally important. Ecologists describe it through what is called the facilitation model of succession, the idea that each arriving species does not simply occupy space, but actively engineers the conditions that allow the next species to follow. The thistle root breaks the compacted layer fractionally. When it dies back, it leaves organic matter. That organic matter feeds microbial communities. Those communities begin to restore the chemistry that allows more complex root systems to establish. The grass holds the surface against erosion, trapping moisture, creating the thin layer of shadow that allows seeds requiring less direct light to germinate beneath it. None of this was seeded, none of it was planted, and there were no programs, no interventions, no human hands involved. This was entirely the soil seed bank activating dormant seeds that had been present in the ground, suppressed by decades of herbicide application, now finding conditions in which they could finally respond. And no, I'm not making that up. The soil seed bank is a real and well-documented phenomenon. Seeds of many species can remain viable in soil for decades, sometimes longer, waiting for the precise combination of light, moisture, and chemical absence that signals their moment. The cessation of chemical inputs in 2011 was for thousands of dormant seeds, that signal. By the end of the first year, the visual character of the land had already begun to shift. Not dramatically, not in any way that photographs would capture compellingly. But the monoculture flatness was breaking up at its surface into something more textured, more varied in height and density. By the middle of 2012, roughly 18 months after abandonment, the small mammals had arrived. Voles moved into the grass cover. Shrews followed, drawn by the invertebrate populations that were beginning to recover in the newly organic surface layer. Hares appeared, hares need cover, and the thickening pioneer vegetation was beginning to provide it. These were not large, visible, dramatic arrivals. They were the quiet filling in of a trophic level that had been almost entirely absent from the land for decades. But the raptors noticed. Kestrels were spotted hovering over the former fields within 18 months of the cessation. Marsh harriers, which require both prey and a degree of vegetative structure to hunt effectively, were recorded at the site's wetland margins. The predator-prey relationship was reassembling itself from the bottom up, each level of the food web clicking into place as the one below it stabilized. The dead ground was becoming something. Slowly, without announcement, without anyone managing it, the land was beginning to move through the early stages of a process that ecologists had theorized about, but rarely had the opportunity to observe at this scale in a European context. The thistles were a warning sign. The researchers who had been watching this land since before the cessation ignored it, not out of negligence, but because what the thistles were signalling seemed at the time too large to be plausible, that the facilitation cascade now underway was not going to stop at pioneer grasses and small mammals. That something was building in the structure of this landscape that would, within a decade, make it unrecognizable. But that realization was still years away. The land had a full decade before the outside world would begin to pay serious attention. And the clock had already started. By the middle of the second decade, the land had stopped being empty. That is the only way to describe what happened next. Not colonized, not managed, not seeded or stocked or introduced. Just no longer empty. Something had filled it, and that something had arrived entirely on its own terms. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything. The first large herbivores to return were not placed there. There was no ceremony, no release gate, no biologist with a clipboard counting animals into a pen. The red deer came because the scrub was thick enough to hide in, and the ungrazed grassland was rich enough to be worth the journey. That is the whole explanation. That is the entire mechanism. A landscape that had once been scraped clean of anything a cow or a tractor could not use had over roughly 10 years quietly rebuilt the conditions that a wild animal requires. Cover and food. Silence and space. The deer found it before any survey team did. By 2014 and into 2015, red deer and roe deer populations had established themselves in measurable numbers across the site. The roe deer came first, threading through the younger scrub zones where hawthorn and blackthorn had begun to knit together into something resembling a hedgerow, then a thicket, then genuine cover. The red deer followed, drawn to the open grassland corridors that ran between the denser woody patches. These were animals reading a landscape, and what they were reading told them to stay. The science here is worth slowing down for, because it is not complicated once you see it. Ungrazed grassland grows tall and structurally complex. Tall grass means invertebrates. Invertebrates mean birds. Birds mean predator pressure from above, which pushes small mammals into the thicker cover. The thicker cover grows faster because nothing is eating it back. The whole system is a set of interlocking feedback loops, and the arrival of the deer was not the beginning of those loops. It was the moment the loops became visible from the outside. The deer were a symptom of success, not the cause of it. A lot of people never heard about this part. The early rewilding literature focused on the vegetation surveys, the soil recovery data, the return of pollinators. The ungulate story was quieter, tracked in footprints and camera trap images, and the occasional long lens photograph from a survey team that happened to be in the right place at the right time. But it was happening. It was very much happening. Then came the horses. Konik horses, a semi-wild breed with deep genetic roots in the European wild horse lineage, had been reintroduced to rewilded corridors in adjacent regions as part of broader European restoration programs. What nobody had fully modelled was how far they would move. Horses are not deer. They do not slip quietly through scrub. They walk in groups. They follow water. They push through vegetation rather than around it. And they remember routes. By the mid-2010s, trail camera evidence was picking up Konik-type animals moving along the site's western boundary, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, depending on whether you were the horse or the ecologist who had to explain to a funding committee why the grazing pressure models now needed to be completely revised. The horses changed the vegetation structure in ways that the deer alone could not. Deer are browsers and selective grazers. They take what they want and leave the rest. Horses graze more broadly, more heavily, and they create what ecologists call a mosaic. Patches of close-cropped grass interspersed with taller, rougher growth, interspersed with scrub, interspersed with open ground. That mosaic is not an accident of chaos. It is precisely the habitat architecture that the greatest number of species can use simultaneously. A skylark needs open short grass to nest. A grass snake needs the taller unmown margins. A hare needs the transition zone between them. The horses, without any instruction, were building the structure that the biodiversity required. And then, at the edges, something larger. The European bison recovery is one of the most carefully tracked large mammal conservation stories on the continent. From a global population of fewer than 60 individuals in the early 20th century, every single one of them in captivity, the species had been rebuilt painstakingly through breeding programs and carefully managed reintroductions across Poland, Belarus, Romania, and the Carpathian regions. By the 2010s, the range was expanding, slowly but expanding. And the site, with its thousands of hectares of ungrazed grassland, its recovering woodland edges, its near-total absence of human disturbance, sat at the outer margin of where that expansion was reaching. Bison were not confirmed on site in this period. That matters, and it is worth being precise about it. What the survey teams were documenting was range adjacency. The bison population was close enough that individual animals, particularly young dispersing males, were moving through the broader landscape in which the site sat. The boundary was being tested. The conditions were being assessed in whatever way a bison assesses conditions, which is mostly by walking in a direction and seeing what happens. By the time the Rewilding Europe annual survey compiled its 2025 data, the picture had sharpened considerably. More than 2,500 large herbivore individuals were recorded across the broader rewilded zone by 2026. Deer, horses, and at the outer margins, bison. A landscape that had carried 0 wild ungulates 15 years earlier was now supporting a grazing community of a scale and diversity that had not existed in that part of Europe within living memory. The grazing pressure those animals created was not destruction, it was architecture. The mosaic of open and closed habitat, short grass here, tall grass there, scrub advancing in one place and being held back in another, was the structural foundation on which everything else depended: the insects, the birds, the small mammals, the reptiles. All of it rested on the pattern that the grazers were drawing across the land, with their hooves and their teeth and their weight. The horse's gradual push along the western boundary would come back to haunt the site's original vegetation models. But that's getting ahead of the story, because something else had noticed the grazers, something that had been watching from a distance, tracking the herds, learning the corridors, something that does not appear on any introduction list, because nobody introduced it. It came on its own. And when it arrived, it changed everything again. There is a moment in the X-Force expedition logs from March 2025 that the team noted almost as an aside: trail evidence. Paw prints in soft ground near the northern water corridor. Scat, the unmistakable signature of wolves. And alongside it, on a separate transect, the smaller, cleaner prints of lynx. Neither animal had been placed there, neither had been planned for. Both had arrived through natural dispersal from recovering European populations that had themselves been rebuilding quietly for decades, while nobody was quite watching. Dr. Sergei Gashak spent years monitoring the Chernobyl exclusion zone, a place abandoned by humans under very different circumstances. What his long-term data showed was that apex predator return was not simply an addition to a recovering ecosystem. It was a reorganization of it. The prey animals changed their behavior. They avoided certain areas. They moved differently, grazed differently, rested in different places. The vegetation in the avoided zones recovered. The whole system restructured itself around the presence of a predator that was not even always visible. Ecologists call it the landscape of fear, and it is one of the most powerful forces in a wild system, more powerful in some ways than the predator itself. That is what was now present in this landscape. Not just wolves and lynx as biological facts, but the behavioral pressure their presence creates, the deer moving differently, the horses avoiding the low corridors at dusk, the grassland in those corridors beginning, slowly, to recover in ways that no grazing plan had anticipated. Think back to the cold open, the last tractor, the gate closing, the silence that followed. What looked like an ending was a question being asked of the land, and the land, given enough time and enough space, answered it in the only language it knows. It filled itself, first with grass, then with scrub, then with deer and horses, and the edges of a bison range, and then, unannounced, unmanaged, and entirely on its own terms, with the animals that sit at the top. We didn't restore the valley. We returned the animal that knew how and then got out of its way. The X-Force expeditions are still running. Subscribe to catch the next comeback story before it disappears back into the trees.